It's the trust, it's the extent to which you think that someone understands your values, the extent to which you feel heard. Those are the things that end up truly making the difference for people. And those are things that are pretty independent of the name above the door.
Hello, this is Shawn Budde of Ensemble X, and this is the Ensemble X Exchange podcast. Today I'm talking with Caitlyn Driehorst, the founder and CEO of RightWise Wealth, an RIA serving high earners that distributes its services via innovative ambassador community. Caitlyn began her career at the Boston Consulting Group and held strategy roles at Capital Group American Funds and 2 venture-backed wealth startups. She holds a BA from the University of Chicago and an MBA from UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. Welcome, Caitlyn.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad I could provide some tongue twisters for you.
Yeah. So you say you started your career at Boston Consulting Group, but before you graduated college, you had some pretty interesting work experiences. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I think, I reflect back on my college years and I remember 2 phone calls home to some very confused and alarmed parents. The first phone call, I remember calling them and letting them know that I had decided to take all of their tuition dollars for this private education and major in Russian literature. I said, don't worry, I want to be practical. I'm going to double major. I'm also going to major in English literature. So I definitely... All the literatures. I definitely remember, there's some confusion and alarm on the other end of the line. But I was able to have some pretty cool work experiences in college. So I got to intern for the U.S. Embassy to Russia in Moscow, which was a pretty cool experience. And that summer, I also got to work for a winery in the Republic of Georgia. And that was also a really fascinating experience in the wine district of Kakheti in the Caucasus Mountains. I actually think of that as really my first experience in entrepreneurship because both of those internships arose just by me emailing people and being like, hey, I think what you're doing is really, really cool. Would you be interested in someone who really believes in what you're doing on your team? And realizing that actually a lot of doors open if you just let people know that you really are powerfully convicted in the things that they're building.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, after that, I was able to get a job offer from BCG. And so my parents, they're just red apple pie Americans. My dad is a pilot in the U.S. Air Force. My mom is an elementary school teacher. And so calling them and letting them know that I'd gotten this really high-paying job offer in this field called strategy consulting, they were just as confused as when I told them I was going to major in Russian.
Right.
But my favorite part was my mom told me, she's like, Caitlyn, I've seen the movie The Firm, and I know that I think the only reason someone would pay you this much with your Russian literature degree is if what they were doing was illegal.
Nice.
And so I just want you to know you can always move home. Please don't do anything illegal.
That's very funny.
But no, so that was the beginning of my career.
I had a friend who worked for Waste Management, and when he called and told his parents that he was doing garbage trucks, they started sobbing because they were from New Jersey, and that meant he was in the mob. So I can understand the anxiety. What brought you to Russian literature?
Yeah, my father is in the U.S. military. My family is much like that family in Forrest Gump. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, all career military. And so, for someone who really wanted to build a career in the U.S. Air Force in the 70s or 80s, it was convenient to speak Russian in case you ever got shot down.
Got it.
And so my father studied Russian all through college. I grew up with Cyrillic and onion domes and a lot of thoughts about atheism and communism sort of ambient in our household.
All right.
And so when I got to college, I was just excited to continue that study.
Yeah. I had a Russian roommate, and he loved it because he could go to the library and get any book he wanted because there was not a lot of demand for the Russian language version of Anna Karenina. All right, well, let's dive in. So let's start with the basics. What is RightWise?
Yeah, RightWise Wealth. We are an RIA, a registered investment advisor. We provide investment advice and financial planning to accumulators, so high earners in their 30s and their 40s. We provide really holistic, very relationship-based financial advice. So not only do we help people manage their portfolios, but we also help people think about budgeting, think about their values, their goals. And we do all of this for people whose lifestyles are very dynamic, right? For a retiree, most financial advisors work with retirees. A lot of their financial plan is kind of set it and forget it. My parents are out here in Las Vegas. They know that they're going to be in this house. They know what they're going to spend every year. And, it's pretty static. For our clients, they're constantly, having new children, relocating to new states, considering big career moves. So it's a much more dynamic process. In addition to, that service, though, what I think really makes us special is the way that we distribute our services. And that's that we have a community-led growth strategy through this ambassador program that we've built, whereby we bring people in, we train them up, we help them get securities licenses. These are people who are very passionate about personal finance. And they're able to share our educational materials with the people in their circles of trust and then earn side cash and build passive income as there's a good fit on both sides for people in their networks to join us as clients.
Okay, so these ambassadors, what kind of backgrounds do they tend to have? Do they have financial backgrounds, or they're teachers, or what?
Yeah. I would love to tell you that there's a prototypical ambassador for RightWise, and there is absolutely not. We have Dean, who works at a major research university. We have a woman who is an operations consultant for healthcare startups. We've had a CFA, so obviously, a really sterling investing background. People really come from all over. We have men, we have women, people who are currently employed, people who are between roles and just looking to stay engaged. I think the things that they have in common are obviously a passion for financial advice. They also have a sense of curiosity about the world, right? For most of these people, we make them take the Series 65 exam, and the type of person who's interested in doing that, in a later stage of their career is someone who I think is inherently a lifelong learner. And then finally, I think the third thing they have in common is that they're pretty extroverted. And so you take a group of people who are passionate, curious, and extroverted, and we have a lot of fun at our on-sites.
That's really interesting. So you talked about trust. I'm usually on the other side of the balance sheet, right? So I usually work with lending businesses, and people are generally pretty happy to take money from anyone. And more or less, if that company goes out of business, that might be even better because they won't bother to collect. You're holding people's money. So that's a very different trust equation. How does an organization that doesn't have a strong brand, like a Fidelity or a Schwab or something like that, how do you build that trust with customers?
Yeah. When I think about how people make a decision as to which wealth manager they'll work with, I think it's a decision that is both head and heart, right? So on the rational side, I do think they're looking for things like the longevity of the institution, perhaps a track record, the credentials of the advisors with whom they'll be working. However, I'm stealing this line from an executive at Capital Group, but he would always say, no one cares what you know until they know that you care. And, when I think that people think about a wealth manager, they may start with, well, I'm going to work with Morgan Stanley, I'll work with Edward Jones. But at the end of the day, they're not working with Edward Jones. They're not working with JP Morgan. They're working with Jillian. They're working with Dave. They're working with an individual. And I think you really see that in the extent to which financial advisors often have very liquid careers, often switching between firms back and forth. And the preponderance of their book classically will move with them. Mm-hmm. And that's because the relationship exists between the individuals. It's cliche, but that personal finance is personal. But for all that you would think that the role of being a financial advisor is talking about numbers, actually the numbers end up being the least important part of these relationships, I often find. It's the trust, it's the extent to which you think that someone understands your values, the extent to which you feel heard. Those are the things that end up truly making the difference for people. And those are things that are pretty independent of the name above the door.
That's interesting. So, if I think back, I guess my impression, at least, is that in the olden days, you went to an investment advisor because they convinced you that they were going to get better returns than you would get on your own. And is that a fair impression of investment advising 10, 20 years ago?
Absolutely. The way that I talk about it with our clients and the way that I talk about it with our ambassadors is thinking about the evolution of the role of the financial advisor as having 3 generations. If you think to the first generation of a financial advisor, the first incarnation of a financial advisor, he was your broker, right? And you had to work with him because his primary value proposition was access to the market, right? Someone had to pick up the phone and say, I want to buy 10 shares of GE. And that broker was the guy who could pick up the phone for you. So that was a transactional relationship that was compensated by commissions. And you didn't expect that person necessarily to have a fiduciary duty, right? That guy's job was to pick up the phone. So when we think historically to, say like the Wolf of Wall Street or some of these, with the sweat rooms with all the people on the phones, that's really that generation. What I think you then saw next emerging was the role of the financial advisor as a portfolio manager or an investment advisor. And so this was someone who moved beyond, I can get you into the market, and someone who would say, I'm going to tell you what I think you ought to buy. And so that person really views their value proposition as helping you invest. And so they're saying, I can build a portfolio for you. I can help you understand multiple strategies, a strategy for your 529, a strategy for your retirement. But my job is to take your cash and move it into stocks and manage it prudently. And to the extent that your broader life is relevant to your investment objectives, we'll have those conversations. But it's not my job to talk to you about how much house can you really afford, or should you be using money market or a high yield savings? Maybe I have those conversations with you, but that's just ancillary and probably just because I enjoy it and you happen to be on the phone. What I think we see increasingly is a new generation of consumer and a new generation of financial advisor. And on the consumer side, they're saying, look, investment management is increasingly commoditized. I can get a robo-advisor portfolio just about anywhere for 25 basis points. And that's a pretty darn good portfolio. However, increasingly, my financial life is very complex. Just look at this new tax bill, right? The last thing I think that we needed was one new investment account type in America. Now we have yet another type of account that parents will need to evaluate for their children. We already have Cloverdales, we have 50 different 529 accounts, we have UTMAs, we have UGMAs. And on top of all of that financial complexity, you have the complexity of just life, right? That people are looking for connection, they're looking for values, they're trying to make sense of what they want. And so I think you see RightWise and other firms like us stepping in and saying, look, we'll do your portfolios. I love portfolio work. My background's in asset management. I don't think that we need to belie any of the complexity or sophistication there to say that much of the value that we will add will be in that holistic discussion of your total financial life.
So how do you take an ambassador who isn't experienced in this space and get them up to speed? How long does that take, and how do you do that, and how do you supplement that maybe with technology?
So in getting ambassadors ready to launch, there's really two tracks to their education. The first is that we need to prepare them for the Series 65 exam, which I like to tell them it's not nothing, but it's also not everything. The other line I like to tell them is that guys named Chuck pass this exam every day.
No offense to Chucks.
No offense to Chucks. I have known some wonderful Chucks in my career in wealth management.
Can we pause for a second? Can you just describe what is the Series 65? How is that different from like Series 7 or the other kind of tests I've heard of?
Yeah, so the Series 65 exam is the exam that qualifies someone to work with securities. So it's 120 questions. It covers a really broad range of topics, but it covers each of those topics fairly shallowly. Our ambassadors have to learn everything from the basics of investing to different investing account types, the basics of estate planning, the basics of regulation. It's a pretty wide-ranging set of topics.
Okay.
And so what I tell my ambassadors is follow your natural level of curiosity. Many people think like, well, at some point I'm going to sit down and I'm going to figure out the difference between term and whole life insurance. Let this be the day. We're covering your Kaplan curriculum. We've put you in a study group of your peers with one of our financial advisors. Let this be the time. And so our ambassadors, they have to pass the Series 65 exam. The other area that we need them to be able to speak confidently on is different types of financial advisors. My goal is that our ambassadors can be the smart friend in a group chat, right? So I think about my favorite group chat. We're all going to see Beyonce next weekend. We're all girls who went to U Chicago together, X many years ago. I think about it, and we've got, my one friend who's an attorney. Like, she does litigation, but she has looked at every lease I've ever signed for an apartment. One of my girlfriends, she works in health insurance. And so, when I just had a baby in December, when one of my claims was super funky, I got my girlfriend to look at it. And I'm the financial advisor in the group chat, right? Like, someone wonders about a rollover, they hit me up. What I want is our ambassadors to be that person in their group chats, in their communities, in the organizations that they lead and take a big part in. And so in addition to the Series 65, we have a training curriculum that we've created in Notion. We really love Notion. We have videos on there, we have resources, recommended articles. And the idea there is that when one of our ambassadors is asked by a friend, look, I have this advisor. He was my parents' advisor. All he wants to do is meet with me once a year about my portfolio, but I've got a lot of other questions and I feel like he's not interested in answering them. That my ambassador can answer, yes, he's a member of that second generation of financial advisors. They're not necessarily bad guys, but it sounds like you're looking for something more. Let me tell you about RightWise. Let me tell you about their pricing model. Let me tell you about how I've gotten to know their financial advisors, and they can pass over that warm referral to us.
Got it. And then what's the technology that underlies all that? And at some point you got to build a portfolio, I assume.
The technology that we use to provide services to clients or for the ambassadors. Yeah, we use Betterment for Advisors as our custodian and for portfolio management. My background is in wealth tech, and so I really love this stuff. I think that Betterment Advisors is a really underrated piece of software. Something that I think is very interesting about them, historically, the way that financial advisors and others have often conceptually thought about investments is at the line level. I'm going to put X amount of your dollars into US large cap. I'm going to put X amount of your dollars into international. What I like about how Betterment for Advisors has created its software is that it thinks first about the portfolio. Rather than individually managing these line items, the advisor is thinking holistically about the whole portfolio. What that unlocks is a much more dynamic solution that also enables a lot of really exciting tax features. Please shut me down if I'm going into too much detail here. I have ruined several bachelorette parties with my enthusiasm for portfolio management. But I get really excited for our clients specifically about those tax features. Our clients are really high earners. Things like tax loss harvesting are very valuable to them. Things like asset location strategies, these small differences on the retirement time horizon for someone who's in their 30s or 40s can really have outsized effects over time. And all of those make me very excited about Betterment for Advisors. They also recently acquired a fintech called Rowboat Advisors and are increasingly integrating more single stock management and direct indexing solutions. And I've been really excited that the Betterment team has been so accessible in helping financial advisors understand the advanced functionalities those tools are bringing in.
Got it. Okay, so let's go back to the human side for a minute here. How do you find your ambassadors?
Yeah. It's a great question. So there's two ways that we find our ambassadors. One is just straight up through referrals, right? So people's networks, I think that the same way that people look for financial advisors, they're really looking for someone they can trust. Career opportunities similarly travel from one person just talking to another. And so we get a decent number of our ambassadors through that, either through my network or our investor Fenway Summer, their network, etc. We've also had good luck on very niche job boards. So for example, as an alum of the Boston Consulting Group, I can post on BCG's website. And so we've been able to find people, from the Boston Consulting Group who may be between roles, who may be taking a step back from the workforce, who just may be especially passionate about personal finance and need to hang out with a group of people who won't consider their happy hour ruined. Or there's also, I found job boards for professional women who are taking time off for caretaking. That has also worked for us. And also opportunities like this podcast. I think really just trying to get the word out there and helping people, hear our passion, hear what we're trying to build, and hoping that really attracts people.
So we said back in the day, these investment advisors tended to be men. How much has that changed over the last decade or two?
Yeah, so, Cerulli is in many ways the gold standard for all statistics related to wealth management and financial advisors. And the latest numbers that I've seen is that 82% of financial advisors are men, 11% of financial advisors are non-white, and the average financial advisor is 55. So while that definitely does lead a segment of clients, not being able to see themselves in the demographics of those currently managing wealth, I do think it's worth noting the nuance that the average advised client looks a lot like the average financial advisor, right? I think in general, clients are looking for someone who understands their world without them having to explain too hard why exactly they need to pay this much for LA private school. And so you see a lot of symmetry between the average advised client and the average financial advisor. However, when we look at the emerging generation of wealth, I would stipulate especially the emerging generation of earned wealth, you are increasingly seeing that managed by women. And I think that that's really coming from two sources. The first, girls doing it for themselves. We see a lot of women who are earning their own money. And, there's a lot of financial advisors. If all these financial advisors continue being patronizing to women vesting 7-figure stock packages, my business will continue to do very well. That is a tailwind for us in many ways. So thank you, Wirehouse advisors, all named Chuck. That said, I think we see a female-led buyer happening for a second reason, and that's that shifting value proposition of advice that I was talking about. When the value proposition of a financial advisor was really led more by investments, I think you typically saw the household shopping process for a financial advisor instigated by the male partner in a stereotypical household, because historically, I think men have been more attracted to the gain-seeking, the risk-seeking side of investing. So I think in a stereotypical man-woman household, the man historically led that buying process. However, as now the role of a financial advisor is increasingly led by the financial planning value proposition, which is heavily administrative and very chore-based, I think that we often see a buying process that's led by the wife. She's looking for someone to help with a rollover because she also moves the gardener from Tuesdays to Thursdays and makes sure that the Verbo for Maui is booked properly. And I don't necessarily think that that's a super progressive movement here, but I do think that it's something that will lead traditional firms often flat-footed when they see that person booking discovery calls.
So when you say it's chore-based, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that second generation of financial advisors for whom their value is predominantly based in investment management, that is a highly scalable and very repeatable business, right? So let's just imagine I'm that stereotypical investment-focused advisor. I probably have 6 go-to models that I use with my clients, right? I've got my 60-40, I've got my 50-50, I've got my 80-20, and clients give me cash.
When you say that, that's stocks, bonds? Is that what the ratios you're talking about?
So yeah.
If you're old, mostly bonds. If you're young, mostly stocks, roughly speaking, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, you'll have I've got my youngsters portfolio, that's my 80-20, I've got my, middle-aged people portfolio, that might be my 70-30, my 60-40. And then I've got my people currently in retirement and they're doing okay. That might be my 50-50, right? But I build those portfolios and then it's highly scalable, especially these days with portfolio management software, right? And then the client management, it's mostly just meeting with them once a year. And that is a glorious business model. God bless those guys. My business is significantly less scalable. Financial planning is inherently much more administrative. There are, a lot more chores that go into it. Things like rollovers are highly manual to execute. The analyses are also highly manual. I get an account statement because, a client has a co-investment in this random company's PE fund from 20 years ago. And it's an account statement format I've never seen before. And then it's walking people through things, right? We recommend you ought to buy, this term life policy. Okay, well, they come back and they say, oh, your aunt had breast cancer. It's going to cost this much. Is that a good price or a bad price? All of this work is significantly less scalable on the financial advisor. I think it's one reason why many financial advisors resist the shift to the financial planning value proposition. And I'm very excited about fintechs for financial advisors that specifically help to automate many of these financial planning tasks, right? So Wayvest is an example. We're a portfolio company for Fenway Summer. Wayvest is as well. And they're trying to bring much of the automation into the financial planning side of the financial advisors that financial advisors currently enjoy on the investment management side. And I'm encouraged by that. I also think that AI, to the extent that it's helpful for financial advisors, a lot of it will be in helping provide scale and automation on this more administrative side of the job.
Got it. Okay, so let's go back to the return side for a minute. How does one think about investing when people believe that they can make a fortune by buying some rando crypto coin or by hitting a parlay on the Celtics game tonight? In this kind of environment where I think we're kind of in an anti-expert age, right? And there's also just people are seeing these outlandish returns. So how do you think about boring old index fund or whatever kind of investing?
Yeah. So our average client is 37. So we work with a lot of people in their 30s and their 40s. And it's absolutely true. Anyone who's in their 30s or their 40s knows someone who made a lot of money in crypto, and they do not think that they deserve to make all of that money. That is absolutely true. However, anyone who's in their 30s or their 40s also saw the great financial crisis. They also saw the market volatility, during COVID, right? And so we see people who, on one hand, they might be very gain-seeking. However, we also see people who are much more conservative than you would expect, given their age and the time horizon for their portfolios. I actually think that one fantastic value for the modern financial advisor is helping a client discover an educated risk tolerance and also reconcile that within a couple. Right? I would say that just again to stereotype, we'll get a husband who might be all about selling Tesla calls, and we'll get a wife who is all like, I'm sorry, you're doing what now for our child's college fund?
Right.
And so there's a stereotype that a financial advisor is in many cases the third person in a marriage. And I think that those, again, unscalable and deeply human conversations are a really wonderful service provided by financial advisors.
So yeah, kind of the arbitrator in there. Okay, very weird question. Do you own a minivan?
I own a Subaru Forester.
Yeah, we'll score that. I have heard that the number one reason people buy their first minivan is they have their first baby. And when you have one baby, as I believe you do, you don't need a minivan. Right. But it kind of indicates you're entering this new stage of your life. Right. And the minivan is kind of symbolic of that. Are you finding that people are coming to you when there is some life event, like they've had a child and now they're worried about college savings the way they weren't when they were childless?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about people's shopping behavior for financial advisors, one reason that CAC is so challenging for wealth firms, anytime that you're going direct to consumer, is that you tend to see that people are deeply latent until they're catalyzed by something like one of these life moments, right? So when you look at something like Wealthfront or Betterment, why these direct-to-consumer wealth firms have often found it frustrating to take a traditional Instagram ads approach, it's that people are really like cicadas when it comes to shopping for a financial advisor. They're under 2 feet of dirt. They don't hear any of your marketing until there's a catalytic event. So there's a canonical set of these. And now that you've seen them, you'll see them in every big bank's marketing for wealth management, right? It's like, have you recently had a child? Have you recently had the death of a parent? Have you recently sold a business? Because it does drive a lot of the shopping behavior. Now, what we see for our clients in their 30s and 40s, we do get a lot of people who are having that experience of having a first child as a catalytic event. What's very interesting then is that we see this what can feel like literally a zero-sum game between what is often saving for your own retirement, paying down student loans, because if you're a high earner, you might have an MBA, saving for college, which, by the way, I thought UChicago was expensive back in the day. I break my clients' hearts showing them what college is projected to cost a little bit. And then also, we see a lot of clients who, even where they come from steady homes, are often starting to think about caretaking for a parent. And so I think another place where a financial advisor adds a lot of value is, when you tell me, I have X number of dollars and I've got all of these goals that are hitting me at exactly the same time, and they all have what seems to be one-to-one trade-offs. That's where not only our super fancy projection software, but then also our experience in guiding these conversations can really help people come up with long-term plans.
Great. Okay, so let's flip to your side. How do you guys make money?
How do we make money? So the way that we charge our clients is that we have a flat fee that charges the financial advice part of our services. And then we have a significantly lower variable fee than a traditional firm. So for a 2-client household, their first year with us, I believe, costs $6,000. We charge that via cash, and then we charge 50 basis points on any money that we manage on behalf of the client. And so the way I'd like to talk about that with clients is when you're at the beginning of your wealth journey, and all of these tax protected accounts, right? Both of your 401ks, the 529, your HSA, we love an HSA. When all of those are eating up your dollars and you're only starting to begin on your taxable brokerage, your liquid investing, we still want to be your financial advisor, right? That cash price lets us afford to be able to serve you and provide you the really high level of service that we demand of ourselves. But we want to be your first and we want to be your last financial advisor. And so by having a lower variable fee, what we hope is that we provide greater value to you over time. If you double your money, which we hope you will over time, over some time horizon, if we help you save, if we help your money grow in the market, we don't necessarily want to double our fee. Yes, the work's increased, but has it doubled? We want to be honest about passing along those cost savings in our internal economics. So that's about how we charge and how we talk about the value to our clients.
That's great.
I also view that as an answer to the increasing commoditization of vanilla asset management in our industry.
All right. I like that. So let's close on this. So when we first met, I really appreciate the way you talked about customers. We find it frequently very hard to get founders out to actually talk to their customers. They've got this intellectual idea, or they can say, yeah, I can tell you, how they browsed the site, how long it took to click on a button, or where they fell off in the journey. But just getting on the phone with them or going out and having coffee with them or whatever is really challenging. So can you tell me about how is it that you think about customers and you engage with customers, and how does that affect the way you run the business? How does that affect the way you raise money?
Absolutely. We started by talking about, my Russian literature degree. And I love joking about how, that's such a useless degree, right? It's basically underwater basket weaving. But I'm just joking. I secretly believe that was possibly the best education that I could have had for becoming a financial advisor. Russian literature and English literature is all about asking these deep questions. Why do we live? What do we owe each other? What do we owe the people in our lives? Where do we find gratitude in our life? How do we find meaning with the inevitability of death, right? We talk about death a lot with our clients. I always tell them, please don't book that meeting for 4 p.m. on a Friday. That is a Tuesday conversation if there ever was one. And so, I don't provide the financial advice to my clients. I've hired excellent advisors to do that. But I do work with our clients on their investment portfolios. And so I often come in and I am continually struck to the extent of reverence at the honor of getting to have this view into the interiority of people's lives, right? I have seen such beauty in people's marriages, right? I think about a husband, passionately defending why he wants his wife to take a lower paying job because it really bothers him that her current role just doesn't respect how wonderful she is. I've listened to, someone with a really large portfolio talking about, her grandfather left her this money, and this stock, but more than that, he left her with, these values around industry and hard work. I've listened to, parents who are pregnant, expecting their children, talking about how the legacy of education is something that they really want to build for their children, even though it scares them to think about putting this much money in a 529. And so for me, the business is numbers, and I can tell you all day long how, I love that all of our money is priced on ARR, that we have the tailwind of underlying market gains, in our revenues, how, hopefully long term we could have liquidity in the business because, there's so many great people who love to buy into financial advice businesses, but it is truly a people business, and I can't lose sight of that, and I'm glad I couldn't, because it's really a privilege.
All right. Well, that's a very beautiful note to close on. So we'll close. So thank you for joining today. You can follow EnsembleX and Caitlyn Driehorst, that's Driehorst, on LinkedIn. You can also visit us at ensemblex.com. You can find the EnsembleX Exchange podcast on all major platforms. Thank you for joining us, Caitlyn.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for listening.